This conference will now be recorded.
Perfect. So welcome everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. This webinar is part of the summer series at the Youth for Human Rights Washington DC chapter. Every other week we do a nice webinar and we take up a few of the human rights based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we debate them. We do nice presentations, and at the end we have a Q&A session where you'll be able to, kind of share your thoughts, ask me any questions that you want, and I'll try my best to answer any of your questions. So today's actually, let me start sharing my screen. Without further ado, we gotta get into the presentation. Great, fantastic. Let me minimize some of the stuff around here. Oops. Okay. Great. So for all of you who know or do not know me, my name is Isabelle Vladoiu. I am the founder of U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights, and I'm also the director of United for Human Rights Washington, D.C. And I've been a human rights advocate for over a decade now. I love human rights. They are not only my passion, but also my background education. I went to law school, and then I pursued a career specifically in human rights law, and I have a master's degree in human rights. So my specialty is actually the law and the different conventions of human rights that are across the world. Today, we are going to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the main document that contains all of our human rights, 30 human rights in total. But today's webinar is focused on 3 of them. As I mentioned previously, this is part of a summer series that the Youth for Human Rights Washington, D.C. is doing. And today is my turn to be the presenter. So we'll get into 3 of these rights, which is the right to travel, and the right to seek a safe place to live, and the right to nationality. So the first one, the right to travel or freedom to move called, we all have the right to go where we want in our own country and to travel as we wish. But before we go into the actual text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because I want you guys to see that, I want to clarify some of the differences between the word freedom and right. Throughout my career, I've seen many different terminologies that are used for different things. Like you can find in the conventions the term rights, freedoms, fundamental freedoms, civil liberties, all of them. And I think it's very important to know if there are differences between them and or just nuances. So freedom versus right, it's basically the legal instruments that are using these terms at the European Union level. For example, I'm originally from Romania, so my first document that I was trained on was the European Convention on Human Rights. Well, the actual title of the convention is the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. So we can see the 2 terms together here. This raises a valid question of whether rights and freedoms are interchangeable notions or they are not, meaning they are the same thing or they are not. What I can tell you from what I've studied and what I've read, freedom was the term that initially appeared. So it happened before we had the term of human rights, and they were only recognized, freedoms only recognized by cities or certain regions, not individuals. At a time of occurrence, as I mentioned, the term was before that of human rights, and then it went through several transformation, and we find nowadays terms like public freedoms, freedoms simply, or fundamental freedoms, depending on the document where we are reading. So how did we come from freedoms to what we have nowadays, human rights? And in 1941, the United States president at that time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, talked about freedoms, and he expressed that the respect for the rights and dignity of all nations should be the same as the respect for the rights and dignity of all Americans. And he was the one who actually talked about four freedoms, and that was the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. So we have nowadays freedom of religion, freedom from want, and you may be curious what that is. Freedom from want, it's actually the economic understanding that will secure to every nation a healthy life. So every nation should be entitled to have economy, good economies, and be healthy. It's more like the security rights we have nowadays. And freedom from fear. So freedom in the sense that the president was talking about is the quality of being free. Couple of months or almost a year ago, I was doing a human rights training here in Washington, D.C. at the Fraser Mansion. And we were talking about what are human rights and what is the concept of being equal. Does equal mean the same? So it's the same concept here, the quality of being free with having equal rights. But only ensuring that people have rights and those rights can be exercised with dignity, then only then people will have freedoms. It is very funny because I did a research a couple of years ago into, the Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of the president. She talked about freedoms as well. And actually, the text of the initial title of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was a debate there how they would name it. And in a very famous public speech that Eleanor Roosevelt did in Paris, she tackled that subject and she talked about why should we name them human rights instead of freedoms. And the reason behind that was because freedoms in different countries, the United Nations, when in the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when they came together, they were from all across the world, but they couldn't agree on the same term. And the reason why is because in America, what freedom means doesn't mean the same thing as in Russia, for example. So they couldn't agree on the same terms. That's why they came with the term human rights, because they are rights that belong to every human being. It's very funny. It's fascinating. I'm very passionate to dig into these little things that kind of like, how do we come about having this word human rights today? So from a legal perspective, though, between freedom and rights, nowadays there is not much of a difference, and it's almost inexistent, the difference between them. So kind of that clarifies a bit why we call it freedom to move instead of the right to move. So let's get into the text of the declaration, actually. Article 13 has two paragraphs. First, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. In this case, states means countries. And everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. So what is the scope of the right to freedom of movement? What's the scope? What's the dimension of it? There are three components of that. The first one is that the right to freedom of movement within a country, which includes the right to choose where to live within the country. So say, I like to live in Washington, D.C. Before that, I lived in New York State. Now, every person in America is free to move in whatever state or city they want, okay? And that it's happening in the majority of democratic countries in the world. The other component is the right to leave any country regardless of your citizenship. So let's say, for example, my citizenship, it's Romanian, and I have the right to leave Romania to come to the United States, but also I have the same right to leave America to go back to Romania or to any other country, let's say Spain, or I don't know, somewhere hot probably. The third component is the right to enter a country. on which you are a citizen. Well, probably during these past months, you've been quite knowledgeable and find more about this third component of these rights because you've seen countries asking or helping their citizens come back to America or to their countries in terms of COVID-19 and helping them to come back. So the country actually protects its citizens and they cannot refuse their right to enter the country. Okay. Well, okay. So getting more deeply into that, there is, so we know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as the title says, it's just a declaration, meaning it doesn't have the power of law. It's not binding. States signed it, but states just, agreed on this 30 human rights, but you are not obliged to implement them in your countries. So what happened afterwards, after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, two other conventions had to be adopted by different countries so that it's mandatory. That means when you sign the convention, it's binding you. So there are two conventions that actually split the 30 human rights and add a couple more. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then the other one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Well, guess what? The United States did not sign one of them. The one that the United States did not sign was the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That's because the United States couldn't agree on some of the rights in this convention, including in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's weird, after you think that the United States was the promoter of the idea of adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But what they tried to create in the beginning, was transformed over time. And right now they decided that they should not be part of this convention. So under Article 4 of the ICCPR, which is the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, which is adopted in the United States, countries may take measures derogating from certain of their obligations under the covenant, including the right to freedom of movement. So the right to freedom of movement that we find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is considered to be a civil and political rights and was included in this convention, the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. So in time of public emergency, says the covenant, which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed. So here we are. We maybe could have never believed that we will use this specific article of the convention to have our rights being infringed, being violated. And that's the reason why the countries around the world restricted our freedom to move within the country and outside the country because of the public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation, and in this case, of the entire world. And the convention goes further and says that these measures may only be taken, meaning the measures of restrictions, to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligation under international law and do not involve discrimination solely on the ground of race, color, sex, language, religion, or social origin. So what does that mean? For example, if the government would have come to us and says, no, only women are not allowed to leave the country, only women are restricted to stay in the house, which kind of happens in Saudi Arabia. I think they just last year they allowed women to go outside of the house to drive, but they still cannot go outside of the house if they are not in the company of a male, regardless. So that was basically discrimination solely, and they had to mandate everyone to stay in the house. Now it is an interesting discussion with the older people because you can say that it's discrimination based on age, but they are trying to protect it. So that will go in the general rule, which I cited above, in time of public emergency, which threatens the life. So that's kind of my viewpoint on the current situation and what's happening in the world. And it's not a violation right now, as long as we don't go beyond this. Um, and here we have again the limitation. Restriction should not only serve the permissible purposes. So besides the two purposes, they also must be necessary and proportionate to protect them, and must be least intrusive means of achieving the desired result. This is a balance test, let's call it like this. What means necessary? Um, it depends. Usually courts, the Supreme Court is the one who decides if a case is brought before the Supreme Court, it decides whether the specific measure, because it will go from case to case. But proportionate means, for example, let's say there is I don't know, dog flu. I don't know if it exists. I hope not. A dog flu, and then they will forbid every human being to get out of the house. And that will be a disproportionate measure. Why would you forbid people getting out of the house if only dogs are affected by that? So that will be a disproportionate measure. Great. So that it's basically all I had to say about the Article 13, the freedom to move. Going further to Article 14, the right to seek a safe place to live. And if you have questions, we'll go over them in the Q&A section at the end. But the right to seek a safe place to live, if you are frightened of being badly treated in your own country, we all have the right to run away to another country to be safe. So that gets us, before we get into the reading of the actual text of the declaration, into the word asylum, because we've been hearing about this word asylum and refugees for a couple of years now. And what asylum means is the protection granted by a nation to someone who has left their native country as a political refugee. So let's see what refugee means. Refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, a natural disaster, or persecution due to race, religion, nationality, membership to a particular group, or political opinion. Article 14, and before we go into that, I want to share, I don't want to get into politics because that's not my expertise. I just want to talk about what I've observed as an individual and as a human rights advocate. 2 years ago, when I was doing interpretation services for the courts in the United States and for ICE as well, I know that a lot of young children were coming at the borders in Mexico, like the borders of Mexico with the United States, and I was doing interpretation for them, and I kind of saw and witnessed firsthand how those kids were treated. And I don't know, I don't want to get into the media and what's happening and what they portray. I don't say they are not true. I'm telling you from my own observation, those kids were treated very fairly. I had to, communicate with them because some of them were very young, like 5 years old kids, and I had to communicate in their native language, which in my case was Romanian, to help them talk with the agents there so that the agents helped them. They were helping them wash themselves, they were helping them eat, they were giving them toys and a lot of good stuff. And I was very happy and pleased to see that. Now, media, it's media, and you don't have to always believe, just be truthful to yourself, and whatever you see that is true for you, it's true for you. So let's get into Article 14. I just wanted to share my own opinion and story about that. Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So again, we find the word persecution and asylum. It's kind of like double enforcing that, asylum and persecution. This right may not be invoked in the case of prosecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes, Remember, we mentioned that asylum is granted to political refugees. So that's why the text goes on and says it cannot be invoked for non-political crimes or from acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. And in the USA, asylum has two basic requirements. And I had the pleasure to work with the Institute of Buffalo, which receives a lot of immigrants and refugees. And there are many good lawyers here that are doing pro bono advocacy to help them seek asylum. So for those who are, wondering what you need to do to get asylum in a country, in this case in the United States, you have to fulfill two requirements. One is you have to establish that you fear persecution in your home country. You mean like you have to prove that if you go back to your country, something bad will happen to you. The second prong you need to prove is that you would be persecuted for one of the reasons that are protected, and that's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or a particular social group. We went over it. In the United States, how do you apply for asylum? Well, when you cross the border at a port of entry, which is airport, seaport, border crossing, wherever when you are trying to get to the United States, you can ask for asylum. I mean, I've witnessed people who they don't know how to speak, but the only word they know is asylum because they are in so fear. They learn that word at home and they come to the United States, and the first thing they say it's asylum. And the authorities have to respect that, and you're not allowed to say, oh no, you can't be the judge of that. If a person comes to the United States and the only word they say is asylum, you have you're it's mandatory so that you take care of that person and make sure they fill out the application for asylum. Now, if you are already, let's say in the United States, there is a specific application. It's a form that you, again, you seek a pro bono, meaning like a free lawyer, and there are nonprofit organizations that can help you do that. So that's all about asylum. And in Article 14. Now, Article 15, and I hope I'm not getting too fast through this, but we are constrained of time as well. And I want to give you all the opportunities so we have a conversation. I just don't want to just be the presenter here. So Article 15 is the right to a nationality. We all have the right to belong to a country. And what is nationality? Is the status of belonging to a particular nation or country. And okay, let me get into this before we get into the actual text of the declaration. So why did the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights use the word nationality and not citizenship? Is there a difference between them? Well, citizenship is a legal status, meaning you get it through law, and nationality, on the other hand, is where it shows where an individual was born or holds citizenship within a state. So to give you like an actual example, I am national of Romania and a citizen of the United States. So you can have, nowadays you also can have dual citizenship. But the reason actually why they use nationality and not citizenship is because of the stateless people. So what are stateless people? A stateless person is someone who under national law does not enjoy citizenship, meaning they don't have a citizenship, the legal bond between a government and an individual in any country. So I think 2 years ago, we did a very interesting pop-up museum here in Washington, D.C. at the Church of Scientology. And we put together a nice presentation on Peace Day. Was yes, I remember now. We were celebrating Peace Day, and we did this amazing information center in the lobby area, and a lot of people were coming and go. It was a pop-up museum for like 3 days in a row. And at one point, this group of people are coming in, and they were going through the panels that show each of these 30 human rights, and they ended up coming to the nationality panel, the right to nationality. And they were very pleased to see that video that Youth for Human Rights put together on this specific right. And when I talked with them, they were not from here. They were just visiting Washington, D.C., and they were very pleased because they were stateless people, meaning they choose to not have a citizenship just because they don't want, to belong or, obliged by the rules of any country. But the stateless person, I already went over that. How many stateless people are there throughout the world? That was interesting to find out that right now it's estimated at about 10 million people. And they actually are doing, the State Department and the United Nations Commission on Refugees is doing a campaign by 2024. So in 10 years, they want to make sure there are less people than 10 million in the world that are stateless. So the campaign is called I Belong, hashtag I Belong, if you guys are interested in finding more about that. But what are the consequences that stateless people encounter? Well, without citizenship, stateless people have no legal protection and they don't have a right to vote. And they often lack access to basic rights like the right to education, employment, healthcare, registration of birth. I mean, you don't have a citizenship, you are not in any, documents, legal documents, marriage, death, property rights. They also encounter travel restriction, exclusion from their groups, their families. They are exposed to vulnerabilities such as sexual, physical violence, exploitation, trafficking, slavery, and other abuses. So let's go back to the right of nationality. So that's the reason why the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights chose to use the term nationality and not citizenship, because not because the two terms are different just a bit, because there are people in the world that they don't have a citizenship, but they are a national of a country. Okay, so Article 15 says that everyone has the right to a nationality. Okay, so even if they are stateless, meaning they don't have legal rights in a specific country, they have the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. So again, it's their own right to decide whether they want to be a national of a country or the other. Yeah, so that's basically it, what I had to talk about. And before we go into, sorry about that, before we go into the Q&A section, I'm very pleased and happy that you guys joined me today. I want to share with you the tools that you can use at youthforhumanrights.org, which is our global website. If you go there, you can do different things, but the most important one, in my opinion, is you see here, it says free online course. So the Youth for Human Rights International team put together a fantastic online course that you can do it now from your, from the privacy of your own home. And it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to complete it. At the end, you'll get a certificate that you completed, but it gets you through each of the human rights, the 30 human rights in the Universal Declaration. Today, we went over 3 of them, but if you want to go and you miss some of the other summer series webinars that my colleagues and I are doing, I super recommend you to go online and do this course. It's on the homepage. You cannot miss it at all. The other thing you can do you saw some of the pictures I used in the presentation are actually from the What Are Human Rights booklet. What Youth for Human Rights is doing across the world is sharing these free educational materials for students, for teachers, for anyone to have access to basic human rights education. So this booklet, you can order it here. If you request it, you can order it in printed version for free. We send it out to you for free at home, so you don't have to go anywhere to take it. And also, if you want the electronic version of it, let's say you want to use it in another presentation, or you just want to have it on your phone. I always have it on my phone. I made a special link. It's a shorter link here. It's bit.ly / human rights PDF. And there's where you can download the online version of it.